Hello. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Manuel Matuzovic. I'm a front-end developer from Vienna. I work for the city of Vienna, and I'm specialized in HTML, CSS, and web accessibility. If you're interested in these topics, you can find me on Twitter as mmatuzo, and I also have a website where I write about mostly front-end stuff. I'm really sorry, this talk is not at all about Silverstripe. It's not even about backend. It's the only talk that's fully about front-end today. I'm sorry, but I hope it's not? Oh, okay, because I looked at the schedule and it just said Silverstripe, Silverstripe, Silverstripe. Okay, fine. Okay, then it's great. I hope that it's going to be interesting because today I'm here to talk about CSS Grid Layout, and I want to show you how awesome CSS Grid Layout is, and especially I want to talk about the dark side of the grid, so all the bad things that you can do or the bad things that might happen if you're using CSS Grid Layout. Who of you does not know what CSS Grid Layout is? Show me hands. Okay, some people don't. Great. CSS Grid Layout is a grid-based layout system designed for two-dimensional layouts. So it's a perfect fit if you are not just working on one axis, but on two axes. And the special thing about grid is that it's the first true layout method in CSS. Of course, before that we had and still have float and display inline block and maybe even display table or position or stuff like Flexbox, but they're all fine and you can build layouts using these tools, but they were not designed for two-dimensional layouts. Who of you is old enough to have built layouts using HTML tables? Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. 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 A lot of you. The fun thing about grid is it's kind of like using HTML tables to build layouts, but of course responsive and flexible and described in CSS and not in HTML. The people behind CSS wanted to bring grids to the web very early because they were very much inspired by what people were doing in print magazines and books, so they wanted to have those features, building grids in the web as well. And in the early 90s they had the first ideas for bringing grids to the browser, but it was just too complex to implement. In 1996 someone proposed a thing called frame-based layout, which had some grid features, but for whatever reason it didn't find its way into the browser. And that was the same for the advanced layout module, which was later named to template layout module. It was proposed in 2005, but it also didn't find its way into a browser. So some time passed, they wanted to have grids, but it just didn't happen. Then all of a sudden, Microsoft released a new version of Windows and the Metro design we also love, and they wanted to enable developers to build apps for Windows using web technology, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And as you can see on the screen here, it's very gritty. You can achieve that using Flexbox or FLOYD, whatever, but it's tough. They needed something else. They had to come up with something else, with a new way of building layouts, especially when you have a very gridded, I don't know if this is a word, layout. And they came up with the first implementation of grid, and they shipped it to IE10 behind the MS vendor prefix in 2011. So CSS Grid Layout is actually 8 years old. That was the first implementation by Microsoft. They invented grid. One of the few great things they invented. Someone might say, not me. Then a year later, they wrote a specification, a draft for a specification, and they presented it to the W3C, and they liked what they saw. So they took Microsoft's proposal and some ideas from the earlier concepts of the advanced layout module and so on, and made a draft specification. Now, the way specifications work at the W3C is that there is a draft, and then there have to be at least 2 individual implementations in browsers before a draft can become a recommendation. Microsoft had one implementation in IE10, and they needed a second browser to implement grids. But browser vendors were kind of gun-shy. They didn't want to try it because they had bad experiences with another specification called CSS regions. Who has heard of CSS regions? Okay, 2 or 3 people. Some browsers tried it and implemented it, others didn't want to. Then the first browser stopped their work, and then all of a sudden another browser came along and implemented it. And there was a lot of back and forth, and in the end, CSS regions didn't make it into any browser, and I think it's still not anywhere. So browser vendors didn't really want to implement it because they thought it's not going to happen. And then I don't know why, all of a sudden Bloomberg, the media company Bloomberg, came along and they said we need grids, and they hired Igalia, which is an open source consultancy that specialized in WebKit and the Blink rendering engine, and they asked them to implement grids in Blink and WebKit. And they did it, and the new specification shipped in 2017 in Chromium 56 for Android, and then in early March in Chrome and Firefox, by the end of March in Opera and Safari, and finally the last browser, Edge, on October 17th. So all major browsers shipped this huge specification within a year. That was really special. Yeah, that's for the history of Grid. Grid is extensive. Like there's so many new properties and updated properties, new specifications, updated related specifications, functions, and so on. I can't talk about everything. If you have any question about Grid, ask me in one of the breaks later on. I'm going to cover some of that stuff, but not all of it. Now, before I get to the core part, to the accessibility, because I'm specialized in accessibility and this talk is about accessibility, I have to shortly address the name of this talk and the design I'm using. Of course, it's based on the LP, The Dark Side of the Moon, by my very favorite band, Pink Floyd. It was released in 1973, and I'm a huge fan. I have all of the records, I know everything about this band. And this is why, no, I'm just kidding, I don't know anything about them. I know Another Brick in the Wall, I've heard the song, I know the design and this cover, but that's pretty much it. I just stole it because I like it. It just looks nice. And I use it for the wordplay. So I'm really sorry. I've received a lot of hate because this is not the first time that I'm giving this talk, and a lot of people went immediately on Twitter and posted all kinds of recommendations. You have to listen to this song, you have to listen to that song. Stefan, who spoke yesterday, even made an Amazon wish list with music and movies I have to watch from the 70s because I'm just not educated enough. And he made it during my talk last year in Germany. So yeah. Very, very touchy subject. But I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only person in this room that has this lack of knowledge. This is why I present to you Pink Floyd fun fact number 1. The Dark Side of the Moon is the 4th best-selling album worldwide with over 45 million copies sold. Number 3, of course, is Back in Black by AC/DC. Number 2, and I really don't know why, The Greatest Hits by the Eagles. And of course, number 1, Thriller by Michael Jackson. That's the number 1. So the first topic is changing visual order. There are many different ways in Grid to change order. There's explicit placement, there's the order property, there's absolute positioning combined with explicit placement, there's the autoflow property, and areas. I'm going to show you 4 of those techniques. I'm going to explain them to you, and I'm also going to talk about the accessibility concerns when it comes to using those. Before I do that, I want to talk about visual order in general. Both the tab order, so the order in which keyboard users jump from one item on a page to another one, and the order in which screen readers read content on a page, follow DOM order. A screen reader is a software that people use to read content on a page. If they can't see, for example, a site, they use software to read it. So both the tab order and the screen reader order follow DOM order. If we change order in CSS visually, if we use absolute positioning or grid or flexbox, whatever, to change the order, it has no effect on DOM order. So keyboard users will still serve using DOM order. So if the DOM order matches visual order, everything is fine. We're good. But as soon as we start changing visual order, we might get a mismatch between DOM order and visual order, and this might be a problem. Here's an example. This is just a basic paragraph with 2 links and a form with 2 input fields and a button. And if I use the tab key here, you can see that the focus indicator will jump from the first item to the second, to the third, and so on. It's very predictable, it's easy to follow. And visual order matches DOM order. Now, let's say the DOM order is completely out of order, and I fix it using CSS. And if I then use the keyboard, you can see that the focus indicator will jump from the first input field to the second link. So it's hard to predict where focus will go next. And this might be a problem for keyboard users because they might have trouble predicting where focus will go. It might be a problem for people who use screen magnifiers to magnify, to zoom into the screen. If items on the page skip around a lot. Here's an example. I'm using here the built-in magnifier on macOS. What you can see here is a simple gallery with some thumbnails, and on the left-hand side is the zoomed-in detail of this page. And if I use the keyboard here, you can see that the screen skips around a lot because visually this gallery is out of order. So this might be confusing to people who use screen magnifiers. It also might be a problem if a blind person using a screen reader is using a site together with a sighted person, and this might be confusing because they might encounter information in different order. So there are many issues here. Also, there are screen reader users who are not blind. So some people use screen readers in addition to what they see. According to the screen reader survey, which was conducted this year, only 76% of screen reader users were actually blind. 18.5% have low vision. Yeah. So who uses the keyboard? Because I'm going to talk a lot about visual order and order in CSS because it's a really important topic because many people rely on it. So who uses a keyboard for navigation? Of course, people with physical disabilities, someone who can't use a mouse, maybe someone who has just one arm, for example. Or people with chronic conditions such as repetitive stress injuries, so people who should avoid or limit the usage of a mouse. And also people who temporarily can't use a mouse due to an injury, for example, if you have a broken arm, you can't use a mouse. Or maybe because you're holding a baby and you can't use a mouse, you have to use the keyboard. Or I met someone and she told me that she wasn't able to use a mouse because she got her forearm tattooed and it just hurt too much to use a mouse, so she had to use a keyboard. And power users, you and me, we use the keyboard a lot in our IDEs and other software, so why not use it in the web? I mean, I can answer that question because most sites are shitty and they don't provide a good keyboard experience, but it would be nice if that would be possible. Who uses a screen reader? Again, the software that reads content on the page, of course, blind people, but also people with low vision who supplement what they see on a page using the screen reader, and also people with learning disabilities. Sometimes they use a screen reader so that the software reads the content on a page. Okay, so let's get back to grids. This is what we can do in grid to change order. There's explicit placement. Explicit placement is really cool. Let's say we have a very simple grid, a 3x3 grid with 9 items. If I use the keyboard on this grid, you can see that the focus indicator jumps from the first item to the second to the third, and then it goes to the second row and so on. It's very easy to follow and predictable. Now, grid gives us the ability to place items in a grid on whatever line, or in other words, a row or column you want to. You can use the grid column shorthand property or grid column start and grid column end and grid row. The way this works is you just select an item and you say, I want you to be placed in the second column in the second row. And that's it. It's very easy. You then don't have to work with negative margins or absolute positioning. You just place items wherever you want. And this is what you might get. So it's easy to reorder stuff, but now again, it's hard to follow if you're using a keyboard, or it's hard to predict where focus will go next. Of course, I know in this example, it's easy to follow because I'm using numbers here, but usually there are no numbers in your HTML elements. So explicit placement is the first thing. The other property that you can use is the order property. Who knows the order property? Who's heard? Yeah, because you've probably used it in Flexbox. It works in grid as well, and it's the same thing. You can use the order property to rearrange items, and you get the same effect. Another really interesting thing in grid is autoflow. And I said earlier that grid is really flexible, so you can also make items span multiple columns. Col span, or what was it in HTML tables, and row span. You have that in CSS as well. You can make items span multiple columns and rows, and you can build layouts like these. And especially when you have differently sized items, things like that might happen. So you might get gaps in between, because if you combine explicit placement with automatic placement, it just might happen that there are those gaps. Now, one way of fixing it is to take items and try to position them at the right position to make it look nice again. Or, and this is really powerful, you could just use the grid auto flow property and set it to the value dense. Then you switch from a sparse stacking mode to a dense stacking mode, and then you get this. So the browser just tries to figure out if there are holes in your design, in your grids, and it will try to fill those holes using items. Magic. It's really cool, but again, order is not predictable anymore. But it's really, really nice. It's just a single property, no JavaScript, no multi-kilobyte plugins to achieve that. It's built in the browser, and all browsers support it. The next thing is really awesome, areas. This is so interesting. Let's say we have a site like this. There's a header, there's a main content, there are ads, a newsletter sign up, and a footer. On mobile, that's a single column layout with 5 boxes. Web design is so exciting sometimes. Now, we can describe this layout that's in HTML in CSS as well. We could select the body element, for example, and set display to grid, or any wrapper element, whatever. And then we can use the grid template areas to also describe this layout in CSS. And we can create so-called areas, and you can create an area by defining any name, like header or content, ads, whatever. And that's it. If you do that, nothing will happen. But let's say someone from the marketing department comes along and says, you know what, we really have to push our newsletter signups, our subscriptions. Now, what you should do is to go to your HTML, PHP, whatever, and move this newsletter sign up in the page. But you don't have to with grid. The only thing you have to do is to just move this line up, and then the order will change on the page. No negative margins, no absolute positioning. It's really cool, but it sucks for keyboard users because, again, it changes only visual order. Now, of course, it doesn't look that bad in the screen, but usually the main content is much larger. So the focus will jump from the header down to the main content, back up to the sign up, and so on. And that's pretty shitty. Now, I know that you're smart. You're thinking, who uses a keyboard on mobile? According to the screen reader survey from 2017, for 15.7% of participants. And of course, you can make areas for multi-column and multi-row layouts as well. So you can make the header span 2 columns, the newsletter span 2 columns, the content span 2 rows, and so on. So you can also describe layouts in CSS. Multi-column and multi-row layouts like that. Okay, so if you're somewhat into CSS, that was probably pretty interesting and really cool, and you want to try it right away because it's a lot of interesting and awesome stuff. But it's also very powerful, and I don't know, a lot of responsibility is needed to decide when to use it and to test it and so on. But whose responsibility is it, or whose responsibility should it be? Our responsibility as web developers? I don't know, it's just a lot of responsibility because there are so many different ways of achieving layout and reordering stuff, and at the same time there are so many ways of creating very bad experiences for people. I don't believe that it's our responsibility, or that it should be, but it is, unfortunately. So take a look at our options. We could change source order dynamically for every breakpoint using JavaScript. Nah, we're not going to do that. We could use tab index. Tab index changes the tab order. It's an attribute that you can add to any HTML element, and it will change the natural tab order. Or you can use aria flow too, which will also change the order in which screen reader read. But that's a really, really bad practice. You shouldn't do that at all. AriaFlow 2 doesn't work with many screen readers, and tab index, using tab index higher than 0 is one of the worst practices there are. We could do browser sniffing and send different HTML sources to each device type. I think we've learned that browser sniffing is a really, really bad idea, so we're not going to do that. We could mitigate the problem by providing skip links. Who knows what a skip link is? Okay. So a skip link is a link that's only visible when you use the tab key or a screen reader, and it lets you jump directly to a certain part of your page. So it's just an anchor that's hidden, but it's visible when you focus it. So you can, if you press a tab key on some website, you will see all of a sudden a link pop up, and it will bring you to the main content of your page or to the footer and so on. But we should do that anyway. So if you're not using skip links on your websites, please start now. It's really helpful because it's great for keyboard users. They don't have to go through the whole navigation on your page. They can directly jump to the main content. Or we could just not change visual order. That will work. And that's actually what the W3C recommends. They say authors must use order and the grid placement properties only for visual, not logical reordering of content. Yeah. We can do it, we will do it, because sometimes we even have to. Leonie Watson, she's an accessibility expert, said, brilliant on the one hand for them trying to at least advise everybody in the right direction, but really, come on. Suggesting that we don't all use it just because of this, I think, is wishful thinking. So what do we do? First of all, if you have to work on the front end, you should think about source order before writing HTML and CSS. You have to closely work with designers and give them feedback if you see that there are problems. For example, if you're transitioning from a mobile layout to desktop layout, if there are a lot of things, reordering things going on, tell them before you write HTML and CSS. You should start with a well-structured HTML document. A lot of JavaScript people forget that a lot, that there's the thing that gets delivered to the user is HTML in the end and not React or Vue or whatever. Write CSS mobile first, it's just a tip, and change layout according to screen sizes and test a lot, especially on different screen sizes. Test your website using the keyboard. Just press the tab key and try to navigate your website using just the keyboard. That's actually one of the tab key is very powerful. So if you want to test the accessibility of your website, but you don't know screen readers and you don't know much about accessibility, just put your mouse away and try to use your site with the tab key. It will tell you so much about the accessibility and the quality of the websites you've built. And if you see that there is a lot of reordering going on, don't change order in CSS, but go back to the source and change it in HTML, PHP, whatever. A Dark Side of the Moon spent 736 weeks on the American Billboard chart. That's more than 14 years. There were 14 years in this chart. I totally not care about. I don't know the Billboard charts, but there were 14 years in there. So I guess it's pretty good. The LP is pretty good. I was in Poland last year and I gave this talk, and I went to a record store and I went into the record store, and I swear the first LP I saw was The Dark Side of the Moon, so I had to buy it, but I still didn't listen to it, I'm sorry. But it looks nice on my shelf, it's nice. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is compromising on semantics. Many experts, including Rachel Andrew, who also works for the CSS working group, have already very early feared that developers will start compromising on semantics just in order to be able to use grid. And here's an example. Let's say we have a form. In this form, I have two divs. In each div, there is a label and an input field, a simple input, text input field. And then I have a field set and the legend says shirt size, and I have two radio buttons. The first is labeled S for small, and the second one is labeled M for medium. This might look a little bit like that. So the input field is right next to the label, and the field set has its default styling. Now, I want to clean this up a bit. I want to change the layout. I want the labels to be in one column and all the input fields in another column. Pretty easy. I select the form. I set display to grid and create a new grid. Then I use the grid template columns property to create two columns. The max content keyword will make the column as big as the largest label. So that's really cool. You don't need JavaScript to get the size of the largest label. Grid will do that automatically. This is not, max content is not part of the grid specification, but of the intrinsic and extrinsic sizing specification. And the second column will have a max width of 600 pixels, and I also want some spacing between my items, and I can use the grid gap property. So you also don't need margins to get spacing between items. You can use this grid gap property. And this is what it looks like, not exactly what I expected. The first div is in the first column, the second div is in the second column, and the field set is in the first column. But I want all the labels to be in one column and the fields in another column. And the reason why this is happening is because only direct child items of a grid container will be placed in the grid. So the two divs and the field set. I'm doing this job for quite a while now, for more than 10 years. I know what to do. I just get rid of the divs. Then I get rid of the field sets, and I replace the legend with a strong element. I wrap all the items, and bam, problem solved. Looks nice, but it's not the best solution. First of all, it's less semantic and the user experience is worse for screen reader users because we've removed semantics by removing the field set. The field set conveys some valuable information to the screen reader. I'm going to show it in a second. So it's less semantic, and another reason is it's less readable when rendered without CSS. And that happens. If you've ever been to Italy on vacation, you will experience something like that a lot. CSS won't just make it over the network, and sometimes you only get HTML, and you're happy when you have at least HTML. Okay, so we shouldn't compromise on semantics. What can we do? There is a thing called subgrid, and subgrid is really cool. Subgrid gives us the ability to pass characteristics of a grid items to its child items. So the children of grid items will take part in the grid, and this is really nice. So we could select the div, and the field set says display to grid, and the grid template columns property to subgrid. So the divs and the field sets are not in the grid anymore, but their children are. And the special thing about CSS subgrid is that it's supported in all the browsers. So browser support is perfect. And of course not. It's just supported in Firefox. It's pretty new. It's part of level 2 of the grid's specification. So unfortunately, we can't use that. Okay, what else? There is a thing called display contents. Who of you has heard of display contents? Okay. Display contents is interesting. If you set display to contents on an item, all the children of this item will act as if the parent item does not exist. Sounds like a great solution for our problem. So we select the div and the field set display to contents, and we've achieved the layout we want. That's great. Pretty awesome. And I'm sorry, but there's a but. It's not supported in Edge. And that's not the issue. The real issue here is the reason why it's not supported in Edge. There is a bug in most other browsers, in Chrome, Safari, iOS, and all the WebKit and Blink browsers, which causes an element that has display set to contents to be removed from the accessibility tree. That means that if you set display contents to an element, it's completely inaccessible to screen reader users. Like setting display none, for example, or just like removing it from the DOM. And that's a big problem. It has been fixed in Firefox, but it's still present in all the other browsers, and it will be present probably in Edge as well, because Edge is going to switch engines. So, yeah. I'm not sure if I'm going to have audio. Oh, I have. Okay. This is our form again, and I'm using VoiceOver. This is the built-in screen reader on macOS to read this field set, and I hope that you can hear it.
S, selected radio button, 1 of 2, shirt size. N, selected radio button, 2 of 2, shirt size.
So I was jumping from one radio button to another, and the screen reader said M selected. M is the label, selected means that it's selected, okay. And it also reads the legend. It also reads shirt size, so that I know where I am exactly, in which field sets am I navigating. So that's a really important and valuable information, especially if you have bad labels like S and M or L and XL. Okay. Now, if you remove the field set, or if we set display to contents, whatever, it will look like this.
Selected radio button 1 of 2. M selected radio button 2 of 2.
Of course, it still works, but this context of the field set and the legend is gone. Because if you set display to contents, the field set doesn't exist for the screen reader anymore, and the legend doesn't get read out. And of course, this doesn't just apply to CSS Grid Layout. So for example, if you have a list and you want to reset list style and padding and margin, that's something we do a lot. You could just set display to contents because the children will ignore the parents, and all of that styling is gone. That's really cool. I'd love to use it right away, but it's unfortunately completely inaccessible. In 1975, Pink Floyd helped to finance the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail by the comedy group Monty Python. Some other investors were Led Zeppelin and Genesis. I'm pretty sure that they are all comedy fans, and that wasn't about taxes or anything. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is cross-browser support. If you remember, I told you that Microsoft shipped Grid in 2011, and all the browsers shipped the updated specification 2 years ago. And there are many differences. So on the left-hand side, you can see the features in the current specification, and in each right column you can see the prefix Microsoft equivalent. So the Microsoft implementation is very limited. It pretty much only supports explicit placement, and that's it. But if you want to use it, you can. You just add the prefix properties to your CSS. And here I'm creating a grid with 2 columns and 2 rows. This is how it looks like in Chrome, and this is how it looks like in IE 11. Even though I'm using the prefix properties and it actually works and there is a grid, you can see that all items are stacked in the top left corner. This is because modern browsers support auto placement, so all items will be automatically placed in the grid, but IE 11 doesn't support it. So what you have to do is to select all items and place them explicitly in each row and column. So if you have this very specific use case where you know the number of items and you want to place them explicitly and you don't need gaps because IE 11 also doesn't support gaps, then use it. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend using it. What about Autoprefixer? Isn't there anything Autoprefixer can do for us? Does everyone know what Autoprefixer is? Autoprefixer will take properties and automatically add those prefixes that I just added manually. There are things Autoprefixer can do. By default, Autoprefixer won't prefix grid properties because the 2 specifications are just so different. But you can, and you have to opt in if you want to. And so in your settings, you set grid to autoplace, and then if you have some kind of grid code, Autoprefixer will prefix most properties. You can see here that they're not prefixed in the grid gap property because, again, it's not supported in the old specification. But Autoprefixer wouldn't be Autoprefixer if they didn't have a solution for that. All you have to do is, instead of using grid template rows and grid template columns for creating columns and rows separately, you have to use the grid template shorthand. If you use this shorthand, you can see it on the left-hand side. It's less readable, but it works. You can see that they will add 10 pixels fake columns and rows to the real rows and columns in order to simulate this gap. It's really creative. I really like that, but it's very dangerous. It's dangerous because you really have to know what the Autoprefixer is doing behind the scenes. So if it was me and I saw the code here on the left-hand side, I would immediately change it and split those shorthand properties into 2 separate properties because shorthands are hard to read. It's easier if you use grid template columns and rows. But if I did that, there would be problems in IE 10. So if you're using Autoprefixer, make sure that you're commenting and explaining and everybody knows what you're doing and why you're doing it and what's happening behind the scenes, link to GitHub or whatever resources. And there are more gotchas when using Autoprefixer. The usage of duplicates, area names is limited. There are no negative line numbers. The grid shorthand is not supported. Align content, justify content, place content don't work. It's not possible to define end lines only, and auto placement is limited. I'm not going to go into detail here, but why would you use Autoprefixer in the first place? Well, of course, for IE11. IE11 is still a thing, at least in Austria. If you look at all the browsers, there are 5.5% still use IE. If we only look at desktop browsers, it's 17.3%. And I took this statistic from ÖVA, and they're using large sites in Austria, like, I don't know, ORF and Krone.at and so on, to generate those statistics. So IE11 support is important, but it shouldn't be a barrier when it comes to using CSS Grid, but it seems like it is for many people. Someone asked on Twitter, if you haven't used CSS Grid yet, it's because Flexbox is fine. Okay, that's fine. But 30% also said IE support. And I think we're at a time where our clients don't expect anymore that a website looks the same in every browser, because thanks to all the different browsers and devices and operating systems there is no this is how the website looks like state. So a website might look differently, and so it's also okay if it looks differently in IE10. You have to, or 11, forget IE10, IE11. You have to provide some kind of experience, like a basic layout, and then you enhance it for browsers that support Grid. Okay, I've showed you a lot of stuff, many different ways of using Grid and achieving great things, but also many ways of fucking up experiences of some users. So what do? Are you going to use Grid or not? Let me answer that with a quote by my very favorite band, Pink Floyd. There is no dark side of the Grid, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark. No, of course not. Grid is awesome. Use it, but just make sure that if you're using reordering techniques like grid template areas and autoflow and so on, that you don't use it on very interaction-sensitive components. Test with your keyboard. Test a lot with the keyboard. It will tell you so much about your website. Don't compromise on semantics. If you see yourself changing semantics, so getting rid of a field set or in H2 or P, whatever, just don't use Grid. HTML is more important than your layout. If you're using Autoprefixer, make sure that everybody understands what you're doing and what's happening behind the scenes. And yes, of course, make sure that your components work in older and less capable browsers, and embrace the power of progressive enhancement. This is really what you want to do. Build a basic experience for older browsers or less capable devices, and enhance the experience for more capable devices and browsers and so on. Thanks. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Manuel, for this very enlightening talk about the dark matter of Grid. Any questions? Yes.
Hey there, thank you. I'm one of the 42% that says Flexbox is fine.
Yeah.
So I don't know if my question makes sense to you. But the reason I like Flexbox, and I don't know if in Grid that makes sense, is you can just make a Flexbox. You can put all the things in there, and then you can use space around or space whatever, and then it just rearranges all the things. So you don't have to make the columns first. Like, okay, I want to have like 4 columns and 4 things. And I know that Grid is much more sophisticated, but is there any way in Grid that you can do that you don't have to first know how many things you can put in there?
Yes, there is. There's you can define, I don't know, for example, 2 columns. You can say you have a 200 pixel column and a 400 pixel column, or you can use the autofill or autofit keyword, which will create columns based on the number of items that are on your site or page that fit those columns. But if you would use grid primarily if you know how the layout will look like. So you're absolutely right. If content dominates the layout, then use Flexbox. If content dominates the layout and you're on 2 dimensions, so not just on the x-axis, but also on the y-axis, try autofill and autofit. That will probably get the job done. But I have to say, I'm not using grid that much, honestly. It's just a tool. It's not that it changed my life completely when it came out on October 17th in Edge, and I immediately got rid of Flexbox. Flexbox is fine. You can combine grid and Flexbox. It's just a tool. It depends. If it gets the job done, use it. If not, don't use it.
Hi there. Really enjoyed the talk. Very quickly, in terms of kind of performance, have you seen, say, if the browser window, you rescale it, can you see any jankiness, or is it quite performant? Because, you know, if you're using some sort of JavaScript library that does this kind of, you know, like isotope or masonry or whatever, sometimes it can be a bit janky. Do you know if it's quite performant because it is on the browser level?
Yes.
Is it on the composite layer or paint, like doesn't repaint as much and stuff like that?
Yeah.
So it's quite, you can't see anything, it kind of doesn't jank around or whatever, anything like that.
Yeah, because there's absolutely no JavaScript. It's natively in the browser, so it's really performant. You might get janky animations if you animate changes from, for example, I don't know it by heart, but you can animate gap, for example. So if you're resizing the browser and you're changing the gap between cells and rows from 10 pixels to 20 pixels, you can animate that, for example. Or in some browsers, you can also animate the width and the height of columns and rows, and this will cause the browser to repaint. So that's the only thing where you might get bad performance. But otherwise, it's fine. It's super fast.
So this is more of an accessibility question, but say you got a site, navigation on the top and the side. Would it make sense to actually in the DOM have the content first and the navigation at the end of the document, and then use, say, CSS Grid to put the navigation at the top and the left? Like, yeah, I guess from an accessibility perspective, is that a good idea or is that bad?
So you mean that because people can directly get to the content without having to deal with the navigation first?
Yeah, I guess it's like starting the DOM with the content and having the navigation second.
Yeah.
Even though the navigation's at the top and on the left-hand side. So kind of logically, the content's the most important. Visually, the navigation comes first. Is that, you know, you could use these tricks, but are you using them for good or for evil in that case?
It sounds clever, but sometimes being too clever is a bad thing for accessibility because it's about expectations. A user would expect that the first thing on your page is a header with a navigation. So what the solution for that is, and I mentioned it earlier, are skip links. So the first link that you encounter on a page is jump to the content. So you can immediately, all you have to do is press one key and you can immediately jump to the main content of your page. Or if you press the tab key again, you're on the navigation. So that's pretty much.
Cool. Another question. So would you just avoid grid for forms containing radio buttons these days? Because you showed us two things that are both kind of bad. Like, so would you just use another technology?
Oh no, you can absolutely use it. I just don't reorder stuff too much and don't compromise on semantics. So if you see yourself removing semantic HTML just in order to be able to use grid, then I wouldn't use it at all.
Like, so in that example, I don't see how you could fix it without.
Oh, I have no fix for that. Sorry.
Yeah. So if you were building that case on a real project, would you just go to Flexblocks or something?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Because it's the dark side of the grid, so I don't have solutions for everything, unfortunately. But subgrid is what's going to fix that. It was implemented in Firefox a few weeks ago, and I hope that it will be shipped in other browsers as well. So.
Thank you for your talk. Here.
Oh, sorry.
Having a broken arm 2 years ago, I know how difficult it is to write and surf the web with one arm, so it can happen to anyone. One question: you've shown this nice view of a magazine with different columns that could be arranged with a CSS grid, but they're still missing the content regions. Is there any any solution for letting text flow from one block to another, or is there still nothing inside in CSS?
That's actually what CSS regions that all the browsers have implemented does.
Okay, CSS regions.
Yeah.
Okay.
But as far as I know, it's not implemented in any browser. Unfortunately. I guess there are limitations in browsers that avoid
Doesn't column allow that sort of flowing text?
No.
Does it not?
No.
Is it just for elements then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, the first talk with no question from Christian.
But maybe
No, Johannes, no.
I have an answer. If we go back just a second to where is it? Yeah. Oh, okay. But the only thing that grid can do is you can see this is a 3x3 grid, and 9 items, and the grid or browser, whatever, starts in the first row, and it populates the first column, then the second column, then the third column, and then it switches to the second row. There is a property that you can use in order to switch from filling rows to columns. So it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's something you can do. Yeah. Okay, that would be CSS regions. Yeah.
Any further questions?
If you have any questions about grid or accessibility that you don't want to ask now, ask me in one of the breaks. I'm happy to answer everything I can. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I would